I just want to be where a place where it's easy for me to do business, where it makes sense. Are there going to be buyers? Are there enough cash buyers there to do any business? Well, I know with PropStream, I can instantly look that up in literally 30 seconds.
Hey everyone, I'm Burton and welcome to PropStream Pros, the podcast where we dive into the lives of real estate professionals who've made it. In each episode, we'll explore how they got started, challenges they faced, and the strategies that helped them succeed, so that you can learn from their journey and apply those insights to your own path. Whether you're just getting started or already building a portfolio, there's something here for everyone. So make sure to subscribe, follow, and join us as we talk to professionals who've made their own success.
On this episode of PropStream Pros, Burton sits down with David Olds to break down how real deals get done. From finding cash buyers and analyzing data to building deal flow and scaling beyond the 9-to-5.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining another episode of PropStream's Partnership Spotlight. I'm here today with a really awesome friend of mine who knows, if you were to ask me, everything about title, and that is going to be our topic today. We're going to be talking about life, real estate, and title, and how it all comes together. Please help me give a warm welcome to my good friend, David Olds.
Burton,
David,
what's going on? Thank you so much for having me, dude. My God, what a big honor to be on the PropStream podcast. That's absolutely amazing. I don't know what I did to deserve this, but thank you for having me.
I think just you being you and being out there and helping everybody with their real estate challenges, I think that's what got you here. So honestly, I think it goes both ways. We're thankful to have you give us your time today. That way we can talk about today. But before we dive into, real estate and title and what that all means for those that are listening, I'd like to start with just learning a little bit about you. So obviously you weren't born into real estate.
I was not hatched. I was not hatched as a wholesaler.
You were found in a distressed property or anything, right?
I was in the leftover bin at Kmart. That's where I was, in distressed property.
It's okay.
Where all wholesalers are found,
wasn't
right?
The story.
Yeah, we're in the little dumpster out behind the Home Depot, like just rooting around for bent nails. No.
And now that we've gotten those misconceptions out of the way, let's really talk about where you came from. So, where were you from? What state? What city? If you don't want me asking.
Yeah, no, I grew up in Boston, so I'm a New Englander, carpetbagger, as they love to say here in the South. But I don't have like a terrible story where I was doing crack or in prison or any of those things. And those are all, certainly admirable things. And one of the reasons why real estate is great, right? Because it allows everybody to have an opportunity to, really achieve greatness and make so much money. But no, just kind of a normal life, middle-class family. Did go to a private all boys Catholic school, so did that, was a little Boy Scout, but really grew up. And my dad was a big, fix the house kind of guy, right? He was he's a military guy. So we were building additions and putting up drywall and putting up siding on the house. And we had this, we lived almost on the New Hampshire border, Drake, Massachusetts. So we had almost an acre, a little over an acre maybe. And dude, every year I had to rake the grass. The leaves are the worst thing in the fall. And I remember saying this as a kid, when I grow up, I'm not going to make my kids do all this stuff. I'm not going to be doing all these things. And what do? We all turn out to be our parents, right? So I went to UMass and have a degree in criminal justice, which I never use anymore, except when I'm dealing with my tenants. That's the only time. But I actually worked in retail. And when I moved to Florida, when I was 22 or 23, I went to work for this hardware company called Scotty's Hardware Stores. There were like 170 stores in Florida. It was a huge chain until Home Depot and Lowe's put them out of business about 15 years later. But I found that I was dealing with people who would walk in every single day and they were looking for home repair stuff and dealing with contractors and selling lumber and windows. And it sort of tied in with all the weird stuff that I did as a kid, right? My chores, the things that I had to do on nights and weekends. And so that was, I guess, kind of helpful. But then I bought my first house. And what did I do? We tore up the carpet and put down laminate and took out the sliding glass doors and put in French doors and put up crown molding and, did all the things that I hated doing as a kid.
So let me take my words back, because it does sound like you were born into a real estate household.
Kind of, right? Maybe it was indentured servitude, though, as a kid.
I think all parents do that to their children for the most part.
Right.
But that's really cool, though. No, actually, Funny that you say that. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm a firm believer that most people that are in real estate today didn't choose to be in real estate. I think it's all by happenstance, right? Like we aim for something, and through our experiences, we kind of find ourselves in real estate. And so it's cool to hear that at a young age, you're already involved with landscaping, you're already involved with doing interior design, if you will, if you want to make it a nice name and all that good stuff. So I was going to ask if you're still in Boston. The answer is no. So it looks like you moved down to Florida. You worked at that retail location. You encountered people that wanted to renovate, do all that good stuff. Are you still in Florida today?
No, so I did all those things, bought the first house, we, fixed it up a little. I didn't like really know what I was doing. I didn't have a plan, but I did sell it 2 years later. And I remember going into the closing because I needed to move closer to my new job. And my realtor saying, "Hey, you don't have to pay tax on this money." I'm like, "What?" She's like, "Yeah, dummy, you lived in the house. It's a homestead exemption. You don't have to pay taxes. It's tax-free money." I'm like, "Oh my God. This is the greatest thing ever." So we went and bought like a nicer, bigger, more expensive house. It was the ugliest house in a beautiful neighborhood. Did it again and made 100,000. And it was during this process where I happened to read Rich Dad Poor Dad, and that's what really got me involved in real estate. It said, at the end of Rich Dad Poor Dad, he says, "Hey, if you're in oil and gas, be around oil and gas people. If you're in stocks, be around stocks people. But if you want to be in real estate, go find a real estate meetup," right? Because this is 20 something years ago, right? He wrote that book probably 30 years ago, but it's not like it is today. And I went online, my big computer in like 2004, big keyboard, like web crawler, because Google didn't even exist back then. That's how old I am. And I found the CFRI.net, which was at the time, I didn't know the third biggest REIA in the country. So I went down there, and the short stories got very involved. I started going to meetings and meetups and boot camps and weekend classes and all of the things. And that's how I learned real estate. That's how you did it back then. There weren't amazing podcasts like this or even software, like PropStream. This might have been just a little bit before you guys even started. But yeah, that's how I got started and said, "Oh, like this can be a thing. I can buy and take over someone's mortgage and owner financing and Carlton sheets and all that kind of weird stuff from way back in the day."
Well,
And that's how
regarding
I got my
that,
start.
so when you bought your first home, was the
Mhm.
intention when buying that first home to
Yeah.
actually make profit, or was it we
No,
just
it was
we're
my
buying a
house.
home for
I got
ourselves,
married.
and hey, it just
Yeah.
needed to be cleaned up, and
Yeah. And it
through
wasn't
that
even
process
really.
of cleaning up and selling, you made
Mhm.
profit?
Yeah, and what was weird was I went to the closing, and you see it on TV and in movies. Like I thought it was going to be like at this attorney's office, and they were going to hand me the keys and all these things, and there was nobody else there. And I remember it took us a long time to actually get through the closing process. And when we left, I asked my realtor. Her name was DJ. I was like, "DJ, why did I buy it from Wells Fargo? I don't understand." And she's like, "Oh, dummy, it's a foreclosure. Like I bought a foreclosure in 2002." 8 years before the foreclosure crisis even happened. I didn't realize that was even a thing. So that was my first deal was actually a foreclosure, but not because I was smart or was looking for it. It was just how it happened to be. But no, I mean, I got married. My wife had two boys. We moved into a house, a little 3 bedroom, 2 bath house, and it was going to be our home. And then, like jobs, things happen. And this was in Apopka, Florida, and the place I was working now was in Sanford, Florida. So I wanted to be closer. So we wanted to buy a house in DeBary, Florida, which is halfway between Orlando and Daytona. So that was why we moved. But because we had fixed it up when we sold it and we lived in it for 2 years, that was we bought it for like 97, sold it for like 154, I think. So that money, that was after fees and realtor stuff, like that was all profit. And I'm like, "Oh my God, this is amazing."
Was it then when that first deal happened? So you got your first foreclosure property, did some renovation, made profit, went into your second home. Um, was it at that point that you're like, okay, hey, this can be a thing where I can
Yes,
continue this
100%.
process? So it was the second. So the first property was I needed a home. The second property this time was purchased because of an intention to make profit,
Right.
right?
100%. So I went and bought, it's, you can look it up. It's 2 Pine Glen Drive in DeBary, Florida. So it's this beautiful neighborhood of all brick houses and like these big oak trees. And this is a house in the corner. It had a pool. It was a 4 bedroom, 3 bath. So I was upgrading a little bit, but it was the ugliest house in the neighborhood. Like it was super dated, all of these things. I didn't negotiate it good enough. I wanted to get it for like 175 and ended up paying like 195. But yeah, immediately did the same thing. I'm like, "Oh, we're going to fix this up and resell it." Like, let me tear up this carpet, let me put down tile and built-in entertainment center, a new kitchen, and scrape the ceiling. I did all the things, and because I worked in a mill shop, right? We made doors for builders. Like, I had resources to, just some building materials at a reduced rate. So yeah, no, 100% fix that property. We like re-landscape like 30 dump trucks of dirt to level out the yard. Like, we did a lot of stuff. But yeah, sold that property for over 100,000 more.
In the process of these two projects that you're working on, the first one again was just by happenstance. I needed a house. It's in foreclosure. We renovate it, we sell it, make profit. Now the second one was pure intention. Clearly, you're doing this off just your own experience. I don't think you've learned from anybody but your own experience. So my question to you, because we have a lot of people that are listening, what big lessons did you learn doing this on your own? Because it sounds like you haven't attended any of the local meetups yet. You didn't read the Rich Dad Poor Dad book yet. So what were some hard lessons or some good lessons that you can share with the audience in these two projects?
So the same realtor who I bought the house in Apopka with, she was my realtor when I sold the Apopka house. So it had been 2 years. So I have her come over, and again, we remodeled it, like, cause we lived there. And she comes in and she's like, yo, bro, that wall of dark green accent, you need to repaint over that. I'm like, oh, what do you mean? So I learned the lesson of, like, if you're going to remodel a property, remodel it for like everybody. Don't go in and do like, gold flaked crown, because some people may not like that, right? So I learned that lesson immediately. She's like, yeah, this border you put up in the kitchen of, the ducks, take that shit down, right? Let's make
actually very good advice, because what you might think is valuable may not be valuable to the next person looking to acquire that asset. So to keep it, again, to your point, to keep it appealing for the masses rather than a niche, that's what it's a valuable lesson that you learned.
So we had hung like all of these family pictures on the wall. She's like, take all that down. People coming in to buy your house, they don't want to see that. So, I had to pull out all the nails, putty them, repaint the wall. But what I learned there, right, the lesson that I learned in that instance was, and, my wife, when I was married to the, she hated this the whole time we were married, because even though we were flipping houses on the side, every house we moved into was eventually we were just going to sell and, and continue to upgrade. So we never hung stuff up on the walls. But I learned that, if you're going to flip these houses, whether you're flipping it or living in it, you want to appeal to the broadest audience, right? So you don't want to do like these weird, like wacky accent walls with all the wood or something, right? Because the person coming in may not like that. They may want to add it themselves, right? But I'm not going to do, I'm not putting a hot tub in the middle of the living room. Yeah, that may be great for me, and I know that's a funny example, but like most people coming in may not like that, right? They may not like the jungle gym in the bedroom, right? Like, you don't want to do weird stuff like that. You want to just keep it so it's, it's neutral and will appeal to people, and they can add their own finishing touches. So, neutral paint colors, right? I want to be light brown, or now it's light gray. I'm not painting the trim red, right? Like it took me a long time when we had houses.
No, I think that's something people just don't think about, because, once they buy the property, they're so excited. They want to design it their own, whether it's this or that. So I love that, especially if you're going to do this as a business and you're trying to fix and flip. Definitely want to make sure that this is appealing for the masses there. Question here. What drove you to then want to go to these meetups? Because you now have done 2 projects, maybe a few. You clearly are, it sounds like you're doing it successfully. I mean, you're making profit. Maybe there's some work involved. So what was the driving force to say, okay, David, let's go to Meetup and meet other people? Like, what was your reason behind that?
Yeah. So I actually went to the meet. It was in the middle of that second house. We had just started remodeling it. I remember I was at the airport, I was picking up my wife's sons. They were flying unaccompanied minors back and forth. And I was in the Orlando airport, MCO. I'm sure a place you've been a million times. And I was leaning on the counter at a bookstore reading this book. And I'm like, this is a pretty good book. I kind of like this. And here's what I'll say, and you brought this up a little bit earlier. I think people who are like us, who get into this business and want to be entrepreneurs and want to start their own company, I think there's from talking to so many of them, there's this just common theme where we feel like we can do more, right? So whether it's in your 9 to 5, I could be the district manager, I could be the vice president, I could be the president, right? Because we have these vision, like this vision, maybe like not like an hallucinant, not like an ayahuasca way, but like I can do this, right? I can contribute. I have something to add here. I have some value. And a lot of times that's why people will start their own company. So weirdly, like I thought I hated real estate as a kid because I was forced to do it, but really I love it. Like I do love being able to look at something that's in terrible shape and I can see it in my brain how it's going to look when it's done, right? And that's just the attribute that I just happen to have. So I do, even though I don't wholesale anymore, like I miss being in the grind every day of being out there in the houses. So I think that was it. I knew that I could do more, that I wanted to create something, that I wanted to make a better life for my family and to really build wealth. And after reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, I'm like, oh, this is the way. Like, this is the thing that resonates with me. This is the thing that I want to do.
What was your purpose of going to the event? I mean, obviously you wanted to now venture into this profession,
Yeah.
but did you go with any intention like I'm gonna try to meet people so I can work a deal with?
Yeah.
I'm gonna find buyers.
I
Was
didn't
there
know,
a
I didn't know
purpose?
any of that. I just wanted to be around
Okay.
people who were doing real estate. So here's a funny story, because I know you have a lot of people who are just getting started. So I'm not as famous as you, but certainly do some things. And so I read Rich Dad Poor Dad, right? And it says, go to this REIA. So I get on my computer, pop, 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 pop. I figure out where this meetup is. So I drive down there. DeBerry, it was at the Bumby Theater on Bumby Ave in Orlando. Like, you can look this up, right? So it's like 30 minutes, 40 minutes with traffic from where I live. So I get off work early, 5 o'clock, because I was like a maniac and worked all the time. And I tell my wife, like, hey, I'm going down there after work. So I'm driving down there. So I drive down there and I pull into this parking lot, man. And again, I had no idea this was the third biggest REIA in the country at the time. So I pull in, and all these cars, this is back in like 2003 or 4, whatever. Like, all the cars had the stickers and the magnets, and it's We Buy Houses, Inspectigator, hard money, soft money, 401k, right? Like every car, like 300 cars in the parking lot. And dude, I pull in and I'm looking for a parking space, and I'm getting a little bit nervous. I'm like, what am I doing here? Like, I should not be here. So I'm literally driving through, and I drive right out the other side, and I go home. And I'm like, I was just too afraid to go in. Like, I was literally afraid. And I can, when I was married, I could count on like one hand the number of times I lied to my wife.
What were you afraid of?
Just, I didn't belong there. Like, these were real estate people and I was not. Like, I just was afraid, right? I'm super shy and introverted. I know people don't ever believe that, but I'm very introverted. So I went home, and my wife's like, how was it?
Well,
I'm
let's
like,
let's dissect that
it.
for a second,
Yeah.
because I think there's a lot of people that are probably in the same boat with that mindset. They're just afraid. So that fear, if you don't mind me dissecting, was it a fear, like you said, was it a fear of not being part of the group? Was it a fear that, hey, I'm not financially at the same level as these individuals? Is it a fear of intellect, perhaps? I don't know what these guys know. I'm the dumbest in the group. Like, what was that fear that made you say, yep, I'm not going to even try. I'm just going to go I'm going straight out the exit.
I think probably all of it. I think just when you're, introverted and insecure, even though I was like successful in making, a lot of money, just this was a new thing. And I was just afraid that I didn't belong, or somebody was going to ask me a question, right? Like, I know a lot of people, they're maybe afraid, like, and I had this fear too, right? The seller's going to ask me some question that I don't know. It was just fear on every level. That was just, I don't want to say debilitating, but I'm like, I'm just going to go home. I don't think I want to do this. And man, I was so mad. I remember it was in July.
Well, let's talk this through really quick, because that obviously, fast forward, that's 2002, like the early 2000s. So now we're in 2025, and brother, I'll tell you right now, when I see you at events, I think you're one of the leaders of the group, right? Your expertise, your knowledge in the industry. So for those that are listening that are probably in that very situation that you were in, maybe they're looking at this event next week that is local and they have that fear. Let's just squash the whole idea that they are out of place. They're not, because when I go to the events, I see you talking and welcoming everybody. So let's just let everybody know now, when you go to your local event, it's not that, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to encounter individuals like David who are going to pour into you, assuming you want to accept that information. So David, from a person that goes to several events, from a person that meets both seasoned and newcomers, What's your biggest advice to those that might be on the fence of going to a local meetup? Like, what would you say to encourage them to actually take that step?
Yeah, 100%. I've been there. Obviously, I felt that. I was the person who would stay in the back room and I was afraid to go talk to the whoever was talking at the front of the room or doing that stuff. I will tell you this, most older investors, especially, guys like me and even guys that are older, we love to pour into new investors and young investors, right? Love it. Absolutely. Because I started this when I was late 30s, almost 40, right? Like all the things I've done. So don't ever think it's too late, right? Like, most of my wealth I made in the first 4 or 5 years of being an investor. But yeah, I love seeing these kids that are 18, 19, 20, 25, like coming in and doing it, or the single mom who's like, yeah, I'm going to do this and I want to make a great life for my kids. Awesome. Like, I can't wait to pour into those people. Now, you got to do something, right? Don't just be like the person who just takes information and never does any activity, but 100%. And I don't know of one single investor friend of mine who, does not want to help those type of people.
I love that you said that. First and foremost, I remember having this discussion with somebody who had the hesitation of going to an event, and their response or their reasoning was, I feel like these events are held by gatekeepers, people that don't want to share what they know. And that's, again, what you just said. It's not true, ladies and gentlemen. And the reason I'll say this, speaking to professionals like you who either host events or teach or speak at events, one of the things I hear them quite say is they love new people coming into the industry.
Yeah.
Why? Because they love pouring into them. They love teaching, but it's also an opportunity to bring in more deals, because if someone new wants to get into the industry and they actually land a deal, they could present it to you, you pour into them, you guys are now working a deal together. So ladies and gentlemen, for those that are hesitant, get rid of that fear, go in there. You got people like David who want to speak to you, who want to pour into you. But as he mentioned, you got to do the work a little bit.
Yeah. Two things I just want to throw. One, I've talked to people in other industries and I tell them like how it is in real estate. We have meetups and masterminds and we do all these things. And I get on the phone and talk to people and they're like, dude, it ain't like that in the plumbing industry. Like nobody shares anything, nothing, in our business. Think about all the people who spend so much of their own time and money and never monetize it, but they're doing podcasts, right? It's because they want to help people. Right? Like there are just people out there literally pouring into the internet, hoping that somebody's going to watch it and that it's going to help them. And, I used to get very nervous being on stage. I've spoken at plenty of places where you're at and there's 800 or 1,000 people. And, the thing that gets me through it is if there's one or two people in that audience of 500 people or 800 people that is going to take some value out of the lessons that I've just been through, then that's awesome, right? That's great. Hopefully it's more than that, but if there's at least that. So yeah, 100%. I promise you, people want to pour into you. Yeah. And ultimately maybe we can do some deals together, because here's the thing, like there's no gatekeeping. Like at some point you've made enough money. Right now, I want to do deals with people I like. Like I don't have to do deals with anybody. We're just lucky enough, blessed enough that we're in that position. But yeah, I want to do deals with people who are fun and cool, and I want to, travel with those people and have a life with those people. I want to do cool things. So yeah, if you're that person, like reach out. Let's do some deals together.
That's so cool. So okay, so we went from Massachusetts. We're down in Florida. We've done a few flips. We're now attending events. We fast forward. Okay, so now we're in present day. Are you still in Florida?
No. I left Florida in 2009 when the world ended, when the big recession hit, and we were looking for. Well, first off, again, I worked for 84 Lumber. My wife at the time when I was married, she worked for a big custom home builder. She was the assistant purchasing manager. Well, when the recession hit in 2009, like everything just crumbled. Like the economy in Florida just literally collapsed overnight. And, all that money that we had made doing all these flips, because I was a rehabber and a flipper, like it's gone. We were spending that money, like as it comes in, like you just think it's going to last forever and it doesn't. So there's a lesson for you, like be saving some money. And that's, that's why we like to buy.
Well, let's ask you that question then. Yeah. So when you say it's all gone, was it because it was tied to properties?
No, I'd make 50, 60,000
was it just...
It. No, we're going on vacations and buying TVs and new cars, and because it was this supplemental income on top of our really good salaries. And
Right.
money came in, of course, some of it's taxes, but we're paying credit card bills and we, going on a trip to Europe and we're buying a new TV and doing shit with our kids. And we're just spending because we thought there was always going to be another deal. You never expected that there was
Mm.
going to be this massive market fluctuation, right? Nobody saw that coming. We should have, for a lot of reasons, we should have seen it coming, but we didn't. So then
So what are you doing now? So you've experienced that. Unfortunately, it's not a very fortunate situation. I mean, my parents went through a foreclosure during that time as well. So sorry to hear that, everything was lost, that you had worked hard up until that point. Um, what are you doing differently now to prepare for if that were to happen again? What are you doing differently today that could prevent you from experiencing that all over again?
So we knew that we always wanted to buy rental properties, right? Like we knew that was the game, right? It's a monopoly, right? We want to, flip a couple houses, but we wanted to buy rentals. So we were already, before the crash happened, looking at other markets where we could go and invest because it was very expensive in Central Florida. Still is, obviously, but it's a very hot market. So I bought this great book by a guy named Dave Lindahl. It was called Emerging Markets. If you guys want to learn about market fluctuations, it's the best book I've ever read. But went to actually his boot camp, and he was talking about different cities all over the country, and he mentioned Chattanooga, Tennessee. And at the time, this was probably 2008. Chattanooga was the first city in the country that had high-speed internet to every single house, like fiber optic to every single house. Volkswagen had announced their first production facility in the United States, and Chattanooga is a little town of 200,000 people. And then Amazon opened two fulfillment centers, one here in Chattanooga, one in Cleveland, which is about 20 miles north. So there was a lot of industry coming into Chattanooga. So when we looked at it, it wasn't like, Florida has three industries, right? It's tourism, construction, and agriculture, right? That's it. So when the recession hit, it was like a three-legged stool, right? Construction stopped and tourism stopped. Just the whole economy collapsed overnight. So when I started looking at other markets, and I didn't mean for this to be like a market study class, but came in here and I looked at it and I really researched it because I didn't want to go someplace where I was going to have the same problem. So, Blue Cross Blue Shield is here, Unum. So there was a big insurance industry. There's a lot of actually confectionery, like bakers. Little Debbie is made here. Brock and Brock, the candies, moon pies. There's a whole.
So it sounds like, in order to prevent that
Mhm.
situation from happening again, the situation that you experienced in 08, 09, your counter to that is just to find markets that are just continuously find hot markets, right? That's what it sounds like? Okay.
When we moved here, I thought we were only going to come here for 5 or 7 years, buy some properties, and then when the market peaked again, we'd sell them and we'd move on to the next one. But we actually just.
Do you believe Chattanooga is immune to a potential recession?
I don't. I think every place can have it. I think there are things that are happening here that will lessen it, right? But everybody has a little bit of dips. But you want the little dip, not the big dip. Right. And that was the thing that we saw in 2009. Chattanooga had dropped about 10%, where the rest of the country, especially Florida, had dropped like 50% overnight. Like it was.
You literally just took the question, or you literally answered my next question. And so, well, for those that are listening, I just want to make sure that everyone understood that what David just meant. When things happen in the industry, to the market, it's not a one brush across the board situation. Yeah. So while the recession was happening in 08, 09, not every market felt the same impact, right? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah. And that's one thing in this book, Emerging Markets, like there can be a nationwide recession, which there was in 09. And that was everything that was on the news, right? It's the end of the world, which made it actually really easy to come here and find deals because we could walk down the street and find deals because everybody was hearing all the time is, recession, which here it was very light because things weren't that bad because there were all these new jobs coming because of Volkswagen and in the insurance and all of the different things, Amazon, all these things. So we were actually in a market that was poised to really grow. Chattanooga's done a great job. There's no state income tax. We're in Tennessee. They're doing this whole huge $1 billion development right down by the waterfront here. Things that are going to keep jobs rolling for the next 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, nobody's completely immune if the dollar crash, whatever, we go to war or some wacky thing. Like
no, but you're very right. And I think what you're saying right now, for those that are reading in between the line, you guys have to understand, David actually, if you guys are listening to what David's saying, David is very involved with the knowledge of Chattanooga. He understands what corporations are in there. He's understanding how those corporations can impact the future of Chattanooga. So he understands the policies and laws within Chattanooga, guys. So I think that's something that people need to understand, that, hey, when you're involved in a market, you probably should get involved in that market. And we're not just talking about finding buyers and sellers. We're talking about the whole umbrella.
Right.
You know, what are the big manufacturers in the area? Who are the big corporations in the area? What impact do they have in the future of this economy at a local level? So I love that you said that, and you're bringing that to.
So let me tie that
your
knowledge back to
business.
how we use PropStream, right? So when we're out and we're looking at new markets, like that's the data that we want to look at, right? So I may want to look at, like, you know, what are rental rates over the last 5 years doing, right? If rental rates are growing, that means people are moving to an area, right? Amazon for here, right? So rental rates are rising. Well, what does that mean? Well, investors probably want to invest there, right? Because it's a good bet, right? I want to go and I want to pull PropStream, and this is what I would do. When I was looking at other markets, I knew Chattanooga was a good market. So I use this as my baseline, right? So if today, this is exactly what I would do. I'm going to tell you guys exactly how to do it. I would go pick your market, pick any market that you know is a good market. I would go to Chattanooga and I would pull Hamilton County. I would pull the cash buyers for the last 90 days. Cool, great. I'm going to just write that number down. Now I'm going to go to Richmond, Virginia, right? Or another city. I'm going to pull cash buyers for the last 90 days. Is it more or less than Chattanooga? If it's more, great. That's an indicator that I probably want to be there. If it's less, I probably don't want to be there. I'm going to go to this is how
I hope people are writing this down. You're literally reverse engineering our software, our data. That's clever.
I just want to be a place where it's easy for me to do business, where it makes sense. Are there going to be buyers? Like I had somebody the other day who was like, yeah, I really think in our community call for our clients, like, yeah, I really think Johnson City, Tennessee is good. I'm like, bro, there's nobody in Johnson City. Like, you're going to get a property. Who are you going to sell it to? Right? Are there enough cash buyers there to do any business? Well, I know with PropStream, I can instantly look that up in literally 30 seconds, right? It's
actually, David, on that note,
yeah.
On that note, I mean, you clearly probably may have experienced it before you even decided how can I use PropStream to solve that issue. Yeah. Has that ever happened to you, where you've acquired a contract in a remote area?
Oh my God, yes.
And you're happy because again, the negotiation, we've got the owner to finally sign it, but the disposition part, that's where it comes to a complete end. Like, have you ever experienced that moment where you weren't able to get a contract sold?
So when we were really ramping up, we found every way there was to lose money. Like, we were in places like Birmingham, Memphis, but I had a partner and we were doing a ton of marketing, and we went to like some podunk county in like Mississippi or Missouri or something. We got like 9 contracts. We had like 8 acquisitions people, like 9 contracts in 1 day or 2 days. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. And when Dispo started looking at it, there was no cash sales. There was nobody there. So if you're getting all these contracts very quickly like that, one, either you're probably offering too much because you're not using PropStream and seeing what cash buyers are paying, or you're just in an area where nobody else is making offers because they know it's a not a good place to be, right? There's nobody out there buying, so there's no demand.
So I love that. I love that you've clearly explained the situation there too, and now it makes sense as to why you go in PropStream and, hey, show me the cash transactions in the last 90 days, because again, let's follow the money. The money's there. We just now got to find the deals for the money that's already there, brother. That is genius.
People overcomplicate this so much. First off, I've told you this a million times in private. If PropStream was $500 a month, I would pay it every single day, because you cannot do your business. You are pretending if you think you can do this business without comps, right?
Don't give us any ideas now.
Listen, man, I'm telling you, I would do it and you would keep my credit card on file. But listen, do not overcomplicate this business. 70% of ARV minus this and plus that, and I'm going to stand on my head and touch my elbow to my knee. Like, listen, just look at what cash buyers are paying. It's the cheat code. You know, I've got a 1960s house. It's 1,200 square foot. It's on Main Street. I'm going to look within a half a mile. How many people in the last 3 months have bought a property similar to that for cash? That's what your buyers are paying. Go put it under contract for 20 grand less. You're going to sell it, and just look at those people, call them up. Those are your buyers. Man, do not overcomplicate this. This is a very simple business. Like, do not make it any more complicated than it has to be.
Thank you so much for providing that. And again, good advice, but again, good form of inspiration, because people really, really need to hear that. So again, let's address this. So it's 2025, started in early 2000s. Without a doubt, looks like you've been in the real estate business for well over 20 years, which is amazing.
A ridiculous.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Well, again, but let's let's call it what it is. I think it's a good thing. So 20 years of experience, correct me if I'm wrong, you are now an owner of a title company. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, we actually had to shut it down. We had our partner leave, but we'll be restarting it. But we are definitely the largest transaction coordination company in the country.
I love that. So let me ask you this. So how did we go from fix and flipping to working on title now? What was the reasoning for the
You never
jump?
think, yeah, here's one thing I'll tell you. You never end up where you think you're going to. Like literally, it's such a journey. And, being an entrepreneur, we're always going down this path. And, sometimes you get to a spot and you make a decision that sends you down a different road. For me, I started going to some nationwide events and, was just speaking about wholesaling, nothing special. But my, area of expertise was really the second half of the business, dispositions and really transactions, which I didn't, I just was doing it. I didn't realize it was kind of the thing that it's turned into. So I started coaching. People were coming to me, hey, can you help our teams to dispo and what's your process and how do you do it? So started there and, was really the first person to teach dispositions at scale and taught a lot of big teams all over the country for a lot of people that we both know. And that was fantastic. And then the next question was, I was involved in some masterminds and I was getting calls all the time for, hey, what do I do? I've got this really tricky situation. I don't know how to close this, whatever it was, right? So I was taking a lot of those calls and I'm like, oh, well, it seems
Okay.
like there's kind of a need for this. And the other thing, right? I was doing a lot of JV deals, joint ventures, where people would bring me the deals and we would sell them, right? We're using PropStream, we're getting all the data. And typically the way these work, Burton, if somebody comes to you, you sell a couple of their deals and then you never hear from them again. But I had this one guy, his name was Mario, and he lived in Alaska. He was Spanish, so he didn't, weirdly, in Alaska, Spanish guy, didn't speak great English, but he was buying all of his deals in Macon, Georgia, right? So we were selling all of it, like 20, 30 deals over the course of a year, like a lot of deals. And one time he called in and I happened to jump on the phone. I'm like, Mario, how's it going? My man, appreciate all of your business. I said, but listen, let me ask you a question. Like, I love doing your deals and getting half the money, but why don't you just do this yourself? He's like, well, listen, it's just me. So I can't do all the things, but here's the other thing. I don't like dealing with title companies. And he's like, I love that you guys handle all the paperwork. And I was like, it was like this epiphany. I'm like, oh, all of a sudden all the pieces came together. I'm like, oh, there's like a real need for this. Nobody teaches this. Coaches are just out there like, just find an investor-friendly title company and you'll be okay. And that really wasn't true. You were still, even though you had that investor-friendly title company, whoever they are, they're still kicking all that work back to you. Go get the death certificate, go talk to the seller, go schedule, So
Let's talk about that really quick. So for those that are just getting involved in real estate and they think all they got to do is build a list from PropStream and market to the owner, talk to the owner, get them on contract, clearly the job's not done yet. So what is the process of, what is it that you do after a contract is signed? Because this is, and I've experienced it too. I've seen people that are like, wait, there are issues on the title? What do you mean? Right. And so
what you do?
So what is it? Exactly.
Yeah.
What is it that you guys service after a contract is signed? Like, so I get a contract, I hand it to you, and let's just say you discover there's some issues on the title, and let's make up one that you've experienced and how you've solved it. So let's enlighten the audience as to the things that they don't see that you guys are handling.
Yeah. Well, yes, 100%. And to start with, again, I thought everything that I was ever told, everything that I read or, went to these courts, just find an investor-friendly title company and you'll be fine. That was like all the advice, right? And what I didn't realize is I was actually just their unpaid assistant. I was taking them the contract, and investor-friendly meant, yeah, we'll do an assignment. Cool, great. But all of the communication with the buyer and collecting the, hey, call your seller. We need a death certificate. Great. Now I'm calling the seller. Oh, I don't have the death certificate. Well, now what? Like, are we done? Like is the $30,000 deal done? No, I have to figure out how to find the death certificate, or, oh, I got to figure out how to get this person in prison to sign, like all the multitude of problems. So for us, what we do, right now, I didn't realize that this was transaction coordinating. I just thought it was part of the thing that I did. And most of the people who come to us, they just think that's part of the their life, right? As an investor, they don't realize that there's another way. And this is what I discovered when I hired transaction coordinators into Nationwide Property Liquidators. And then this is the business that we built for other people. So now here's what happens. An investor, instead of them doing all of that, they literally just upload the contract to us. And from here it comes, we're going to, no matter what type of deal you're doing, an assignment, a novation, a sub two, RBP, installment method, like whatever it is. And we've done 8,000 files. So we've seen every single type. So we're going to assign that.
Moly, that's a lot.
In the last couple of years, that's
good,
a lot of
man.
files. We do.
Yes,
when I say we do a lot, we've again, we're not as big as PropStream, but we've done over $500 million in deals, and our clients.
You're big in your own way, but
I love that in our world, we are definitely the biggest.
I love that you've exposed us to that reality, because there are still people to this very day that think, once I get a contract, all I got to do is just find a buyer and get rid of it, and the title company, that investor title company, is going to take care of everything. But I love that you exposed some realities here. What if they need a piece of paperwork? Well, now you got to take time out of your day to go email the owner, right. So and this is a reality I don't think people will realize that may happen to them. You're going to go from acquisitions, talking to owners, getting contracts signed, to now, if you don't have it in place, or if you don't have a system for it, you're going to become a transaction coordinator because of
you just don't realize it. So now you upload that contract to us. Our coordinator is going to jump on the phone. Hey, Mrs. Smith, this is Claudia. I'm working on your deal with 123 Main Street with Burton. Hey, it's my job. I'm going to be your point of contact from here all the way to closing. So you're out. You go do your deal. Go sell the deal. Go get your next deal. Go work on growing your business. And then she's going to continue. Yeah. Hey, Mrs. Smith, I have some questions for you so I can get you paid just as quickly as possible, right? Because they all want to get paid, right? That's the deal, right? We want to solve their problem. So we're going to start asking them. It's like a 4-page intake form where we're asking every single possible question that after 8,000 files, like we know are going to come up, because our whole goal is to solve these problems while you're finding a buyer. So as soon as you've got that buyer, we are ready to get this thing closed. I want to compress time. I want to get this deal closed as fast as possible, right? So that you can go out and do your next one, right? Do your next one, pull your next list, skip trace it, whatever you need to do.
So I love that. Like, you've literally expedited that hardship that's in between, that not too many people are aware of until they actually start getting involved in the business. You don't realize that a lot of these homeowners have underlying issues that you'll discover through the process.
What do we do? What do we do on PropStream, Burton? What do we do? We stack lists. We stack pain points, right? Death, divorce, job transfer, back taxes, right? All of what do you have? Like 56 filters or some crazy thing? Like so many different ways.
Yeah, 170 now or something.
Oh my God. Right.
Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone got a contract, they sent it over to you. Yeah. You did your job on it.
Did our magic.
And you discovered, man, this thing is just a nasty title.
It's a rat's nest is what we call it.
Right. And then I'm sure, you've done over 8,000 files, so I'm sure you handled it.
Yeah.
How thankful was that investor when they discovered the hardship that you and your team went through to solve that problem?
Well, I will tell you this, we have a 92% retention rate with our clients because they never want to go back to doing it themselves, right? So
wow, that's good, man.
Yeah. So here's one from the other day. I do a little podcast. I call it In the Trenches with Your TC, where we just talk about horror stories, deals that should have died, right? Like it's the Morgan Freeman voiceover, deals that should have died, right? So we had this one, and let me say this for everybody who's listening. The day you sign the contract with your seller, nobody ever thinks it's going to be a mess. We're all optimistic, like it's going to be great. I'm going to make a bunch of money.
Wait, can you repeat that? That's a very important statement. Yeah. I need you to repeat that. Nobody
ever thinks this deal is going to be a rat's nest of problems. I promise you, I've talked to thousands of investors. We have hundreds of clients. So here's one that happened. This is maybe a month ago. So the wholesaler he's our client. He uploads a contract. And he's like, yeah, it's great, cash deal. Cool. So our coordinator, Hannah, she jumps on the phone with the seller and she starts asking questions. And you know what she finds out? That this is going to foreclosure in 72 hours. The client, the wholesaler had no idea, because he didn't ask all these questions, but this is what we do. So literally Hannah jumps off the phone, gets her team lead. They're on the phone within an hour to the bankruptcy trustee attorney, right? The person who has actually running that. She spent over 20 hours on this file and made sure that we got the foreclosure delayed. and that client made over $60,000 on that file. That $60,000 would have never happened if
Never. That's
she
what
didn't
I
have,
was just thinking
never
of
would have
that.
happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So,
that's it.
and that's crazy because a lot of investors think the battle is done once the contract is signed, and
No,
that
it just
and
the
the contract
beginning.
between the homeowner seller. And
Yeah.
exactly. Thank you for emphasizing that. No,
Yeah.
ladies and gentlemen, the battle
Right.
has just begun.
Right.
But that's where you guys come into play. Thank you
Right.
so much for sharing that and exposing us to some of the things that
Mhm.
a lot of people don't see. Thankfully, to obviously awesome transaction coordinators like you and your staff, but also thank you for exposing that to anybody that's trying to get involved with real estate. A lot of them think it's just a matter of talking to homeowners and then talking to buyers, and they don't realize there's a lot in between that needs to happen as well. For anybody that wants to learn more about how you can help them with the transaction coordinating stuff, how can they get a hold of you?
Pretty easy. I'm super active on social media. David Olds, REI. You can find me any place. We post a ton of content. But yeah, you can just go to our website. It's the letter E and the letter Z, EZREI, closings with an S.com. Just go there, book a call with me and my team. And yeah, let's just jump on a call and see. We have lots of different plans, whether you're doing one deal, your first deal, or you're doing 40 deals a month. We will find a way to help you, because here's the thing. Real estate has given me a life that I don't feel like I deserve most times. I will be honest with you. I've been able to travel around I've been able to travel all over the world and around the country and meet great people and become such good friends and speak on stages and do all of these absolutely cool, amazing things. But I want that for everybody. And what I don't want, right, is I don't want that first deal you do. You're just into real estate. You took advantage of the 7-day free trial with PropStream and you got that first deal. And because you got 19 filters on there, you've got this just property with a rat's nest, and you take it to a title company and they're like, oh, you need to go probate this before we can deal with it. And now that deal dies, and maybe you quit real estate because you're like, oh, this doesn't work. They lied to me. This is a scam. And you don't have the opportunity that I had, because I want that for everybody, because real estate is the greatest wealth creation vehicle out there. And, rich or poor, tall, fat, skinny, blue, white, purple, whatever it is, everybody has the opportunity to make a ridiculous amount. And I don't want you to quit. And that's our goal. We're a transaction coordination company, but really, man, we just sell peace of mind that these deals are going to get closed.
I love that. Well said, David. And that transaction, ladies and gentlemen, is changing your life. So let's let David handle that transaction of getting you a better future. David, thank you so much for giving me your time today.
Yeah, I love it.
Thank you
Always
for
coming on.
investing into me, investing into PropStream, investing into our audience. Without calling anybody out, in case someone is currently working with a transaction coordinator, I mean, you brought a lot of gems and value to the show today. What one piece of advice would you give to someone that is looking to work with a transaction coordinator, or like how would I know whether I'm working with a good transaction coordinator or not? Again, without calling any names out or anything, what one piece of advice would you give me so that I feel confident that the person I'm working with is good?
Man, yes, they're definitely, we're by far the biggest, but there are some small regional people who are reliable, and you want to make sure that when you go to their page, they've got some reviews or testimonials. Unfortunately, there are some courses out there where you can become certified because you took an 8-hour video course, and that's not the person that you want to trust with your $40,000 deal. I wouldn't, I wouldn't use a virtual assistant. All of our TCs are here in the office. I wouldn't use somebody overseas. Not that they're bad people. I use them for marketing, but I don't want somebody with a heavy accent calling Mrs. Smith and asking, "Hey, what's your social security number and your wiring instructions?" Like, that's going to kill your deal. Like, you're better off doing it yourself. So yeah,
It's a very valid point. As a consumer myself, getting spam calls from foreign countries, trust me, I have that same mindset where the moment I don't feel like you're resonating with me, or yeah, it does bring in some psychological thoughts. So
yeah,
I
you
love
you
that
put a lot
you're
of
mentioning that.
time and energy into finding these deals, and you're on PropStream and you're culling your list and you're screening or scrubbing it, and you're skip tracing and you're making the calls, you're sending out the letters, or you're doing the texting, whatever it is. Do not let that deal die at the finish line because you picked the wrong person to handle it. For us, man, we'll show you how we can work for free, and you can charge your end buyer, and you can literally have the team that's done 8,000 files handling your deals at no real end cost to you. So go on our website, book a call. We're happy to talk you through all that.
That's amazing. Well, David, thank you so much. I got two last questions for you before you go. One, I think this is important. I think everybody needs to hear this. It kind of ties into that fear that we were talking about earlier, that fear of being out of place, that fear of maybe not being at the same level, whatever that may be, financially, physically, or asset-wise. But what does wealth mean to you?
Yeah, man, it's very cliche, right? But it's the ability to get up in the morning, and if I don't want to go do a particular thing, I can do whatever it is I want. And it doesn't mean you're making $1 million a month, right? That's crazy, right? Are you making enough money that it's exceeding your bills and you've got some extra money? Right. And that's reliable, consistent income. This is why we wanted to build rental income, right? Because once we buy it and we stabilize it, and even if we put it under with a property manager, those rent checks are just going to continue to come in. And right now you can choose your own adventure. Right. I want to go on vacation today. I want to go away for the weekend. I want to leave at 2:00 and go pick up my kid at school. Right. I want to be able to do those things. And that's the one thing that we really help investors do is, one, make sure these deals are going to close, but two, take all that worry off their plate of dealing with title companies and making sure the seller's called on time and, coordinating all that stuff. So, but yeah, wealth is just freedom, man. Just freedom to do what you want when you want.
Love it. And last but not least, what does the future hold for Mr. David Olds?
Wow, man. I feel like I should retire. I don't know. I love this business. I want to do more deals with friends and loved ones and, people that I enjoy doing business with. I want to do some deals with you. I want to, let's go buy an apartment complex so we can travel to Wisconsin or wherever it is and write that trip off and hang out and, and just help people. At the end of the day, I don't have the ability, because I'm super busy and run a couple of different companies, to go to every single REIA meeting, right? Like there was one last week, but I was doing a presentation. There's one tomorrow, but I'm doing a presentation. Like literally I can't do that. So, with our clients, I have a weekly, call where I just jump on for 2 hours and they come on and ask every single question they've got. I think we were just talking today about doing one on owner financing, where I can just take that 20 years and just kind of pour it back into them and just really help them grow their business, because I'm not an active wholesaler anymore. We've shut that down so that we could focus on this business and helping our clients be successful. So I just love that, and coming on and doing great things like this, and just somebody asks a question, I'm like, oh, I actually know that. I know that answer. Let me see if I can drop that gem and it'll help somebody else. So I really enjoy doing these.
Well, thank you so much, David. You are an amazing human being in person, and we love what you do in the real estate space. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep helping people with their that messy contract that they're probably going to experience in the near future. But
yeah, we'll get more of those.
It's good to know that they have people like you to help support them with those situations. So thank you for being on our show today. Would it be okay if we maybe reach out to you in the next few months just to kind of do a recap with you?
Let's do it again, man. Let's come on and let's dig in and talk about doing some owner finance or some other wacky things. And yeah, let's teach people how to really not only make money, right? But our job as investors is to go out there and help people who are losing sleep at night over this property. How can we help solve their problem and it also benefit us? That's the goal. Let's do it.
Well put. And we'll end it with that. Thank you guys so much for joining today's episode. David, thank you again.
Thanks for tuning in to the PropStream Pros podcast. Subscribe for weekly insights and real strategies to help you close more deals. See you next time.